For 15 years, Carolyn Mack had been a ghost. Not the haunting kind. Not the kind that rattles chains or walks through walls. No, the kind of ghost that refills your water glass before you notice it's empty. The kind that seasons your soup at 4 in the morning so it tastes right by 7 in the evening. The kind the world doesn't see, because it decided long ago that people like her don't need to be seen. She was, by every official record, a cook. She wore black every single day. Black chef's coat, black slip-resistant shoes, black apron that she hand-washed herself every night before anyone else woke up. Her hands were always dry, cracked at the knuckles from cold water and knife handles. Her hair was always pulled back, smooth and tight, not a single strand loose. Not because she cared about appearance, no, because loose ends get you killed. She'd learned that lesson before she ever learned to make galbijim. Now look, most people, when they picture a Korean crime syndicate, they think of the kind of places you see in movies. Neon, rain, somebody getting shot in a parking structure. And, yeah, that part's real. The Seven Star Syndicate ran 3 ports, 2 casinos, and more import-export companies than anyone needed. Their compound in the hills above Seoul didn't look like what it was. It looked like someone had taken a luxury hotel and staffed it with people who never smiled. Marble floors, crystal, antique scroll paintings that cost more than some people's entire neighborhoods. The dining room had a chandelier so heavy that the original architect had reinforced the ceiling twice. Where's 20 seats at a table carved from a single piece of black walnut. And at the head of that table, every single evening at exactly 7 p.m., rain, siege, or funeral, sat in Malchin, alone. He wasn't big. That's the first thing people got wrong about him. He wasn't some massive, intimidating presence you could see coming. Malchin was lean, tailored. He moved like a man who had been trained not to waste anything. Not space, not words, not mercy. Sharp jaw. Eyes that sat just a little too still when he looked at you, like a camera that never blinks. That night, like every night, he wore all black. Black suit, black shirt, no tie. Like he was already dressed for whatever funeral he might need to arrange. And here's something most people don't know. And this is actually real, so pay attention. There's a psychological phenomenon called power dressing in monochrome. Studies in behavioral psychology show that people who consistently wear single-color, dark wardrobes, especially in positions of authority, are unconsciously signaling control over their environment. It's not vanity, it's dominance display. It says, I don't need color. Color is for people who need to be noticed. I'm the one who does the noticing. Malchin had been wearing black since he was 22. Nobody told him the science. He just knew. The kitchen was hers. That's the only way to put it. Not the syndicate's, not Malchin's. Hers. And it was the one room in that entire compound where something felt like it breathed. Steam came off the stock pots in slow, lazy curls. Miles Davis played from a small speaker wedged between a jar of gochugaru and a container of sea salt. The smell, God, the smell, was braised meat and sesame and something floral she'd added herself, because she always said good food needed one thing that surprised you. She was standing at the prep counter when the clock read 6:47, 13 minutes. Her hands moved without her thinking about it. Julienned scallions, perfect. Thin sliced radish, transparent, laid over the broth like little windows. She wasn't looking at what she was doing. She was looking at the hallway monitor mounted on the far wall. A small screen, black and white, that the staff used to track the guards' rotation. She was counting the gaps, not because she was afraid of the guards, Because she needed to know exactly when to stop. There's a term in covert operations, and yeah, this is real too, called deep cover behavioral embedding. It's when an operative has been undercover so long that the habits of their cover identity become genuinely automatic. The person isn't performing anymore. They actually do make the best braised short ribs in Seoul. They actually do wake up at 5 a.m. because they genuinely want the broth right. The cover doesn't feel like a mask anymore. It starts to feel like a face. Psychologists who've debriefed long-term operatives say that's the most dangerous stage. Not because the operative loses their edge. They don't. But because they stop being fully sure which one is real. The killer or the cook. Carolyn Mack had stopped being sure around year 4. She'd been running this routine for 15 years. 6 a.m. Market. She went herself. Always. The vendors in Mapogu knew her face, knew her order, knew she didn't negotiate on freshness and didn't accept substitutes. They didn't know her last name. Nobody did, out here. Noon, prep. The kitchen was locked to everyone but her and one junior cook, a nervous kid named Dae Sung, who was too frightened of her to ask questions and too talented to fire. She liked him for both reasons. 7 p.m. service. 1 plate, 1 seat, 1 man. He never said much at dinner. That was the thing. All day, An Malchin ran an empire. Ordered things, ended things, moved pieces on a board that nobody else could see. But at 7 p.m., he put the phone down, he sat, and he ate. Just that. And when the food was right, and it was always right, he'd set his chopsticks down, close his eyes for a second, and exhale. Just exhale. How like something loosened in him that nothing else could touch. Carolyn, standing in the shadows by the serving door, would watch that exhale. She'd watched it 5,475 times. She knew the exact sound of it. The exact way his shoulders dropped. She had poison in her apron pocket for 5,475 dinners. And for 5,475 dinners, she served him braised short ribs instead. See, the thing about Carolyn was, she didn't look down. That was the tell, if you knew what to look for. Every other staff member in that compound kept their eyes below shoulder level when Malchin was in the room. It was survival instinct, same as animals going still near a predator. You don't make direct eye contact. You make yourself small. You say, I am not a threat. Carolyn walked in, set his plate down, and looked right at him. Not challenge, not defiance, just assessment. Like a doctor checking a patient. Like someone who has already calculated every exit in the room and found none of them necessary. He looked back at her. He always did. And nobody on the staff could ever figure out why she was the only person he let get away with it. His lieutenants whispered about it, wondered if there was something between them. There wasn't. Not like that. It wasn't romance. It wasn't weakness. It was something stranger than either of those things. It was recognition. He looked at her the way apex predators sometimes look at each other across a field. Not with anger, not with hunger. With something that was almost like, oh, you too. What neither of them knew, what this whole story turns on, is that tonight, something was different. Tonight, in the inside pocket of Carolyn's black chef's coat, pressed flat against her ribs, was not a vial of poison. It was a burner phone, and it had just started to vibrate. Here's the thing. You could scroll past this right now. You could tap out, go watch something lighter, something that doesn't ask anything of you. And that's fine. I'm not stopping you. But before you do, think about something. Carolyn Mack spent 15 years being invisible on purpose, not because she was weak, because the world she operated in didn't have space for her to be a full person. She was a weapon that learned to feel, a ghost that started to grieve. And if you've ever worked somewhere and given everything, and nobody once looked up to say they saw you, if you've ever been so good at holding it together that nobody thought to check whether you actually were, if you've ever been standing in a room full of people and felt, completely alone, then you already know what this story is really about. So stay, hit subscribe, ring that bell, because chapter by chapter, we're going to take Carolyn Mack from invisible to undeniable. And I promise you, you don't want to miss what she does next. 6 o'clock in the morning in Mapo Gu hits different depending on who you are. For most people, it's commuter trains and convenience store coffee and the particular misery of a Monday that didn't ask permission before arriving. But for Carolyn Mack, 6 a.m. was the best part of the day. The only part that was fully, completely hers. She moved through the outdoor market the way she moved through everything, with a kind of quiet authority that made people step aside without knowing why they did so. She wasn't loud, didn't wave or call out. She'd just appear at a vendor's stall, pick up whatever she was evaluating, smell it, press it gently with 2 fingers, and either set it back down or hand it to Dae-sung, who trailed behind her with canvas bags and the permanent expression of someone trying very hard not to drop anything. "These scallions," she said, holding a bunch up to the early light. "You got something fresher in the back?" The vendor, a small man in his 60s named Mr. O, who'd been selling produce at this market since before Carolyn arrived in Seoul, didn't argue. He never argued. He just turned around and went to get the better ones. That was the thing about Carolyn. She didn't negotiate. She didn't threaten. She just had this way of asking that made it clear she already knew the answer, and she was giving you the chance to be honest about it. Dae-sung watched Mr. O disappear into the back and leaned in slightly. "How'd you know he had better ones?" "Because his eyes went left when I picked those up," she said. "People look toward what they're hiding." Dae-sung didn't have a response to that. He rarely did. She bought short ribs, dried anchovies, 3 kinds of mushrooms, gochujang from a woman 2 stalls down who made it herself, and a block of tofu she pressed her thumb into and approved with a single nod. She stopped at the rice vendor last, a heavy-set man named Park, who always had the same joke ready and always seemed genuinely surprised when she didn't laugh at it. "Same as always, Miss Carolyn?" "Same as always." He handed her the 20-kilogram sack, and she tucked it under her arm like it weighed nothing. Dae-sung reached for it automatically, and she moved it away without looking at him. She always carried the rice herself. By noon, the kitchen was running. Stock on low heat, the smell of anchovy broth slowly filling the back corridors of the compound. Dae-sung was breaking down short ribs at the butcher block, while Carolyn stood at the stove and did what she did every single afternoon. She cooked like the meal mattered. Like whoever was going to eat it deserved every ounce of attention she had. And here's the thing about that, because this is actually worth knowing. There's a culinary philosophy called jong in Korean culture. It doesn't have a direct English translation, which is kind of the point. It means something like deep emotional attachment, affection built through time and presence. Korean food scholars argue that jeong is literally cooked into the food. That a meal prepared with sustained, genuine attention carries an emotional residue that people can taste, even if they can't name it. It's why your grandmother's recipe never quite tastes the same when anyone else makes it. The ingredient isn't the recipe, it's the years. Carolyn didn't know the word when she first started cooking for An Malchin. By year 3, she understood it completely. By year 10, she'd stopped thinking about it and just did it. That was the problem. 7 p.m. arrived like it always did, with the sound of Malchin's footsteps on the marble hallway. even and unhurried, the way a man walks when he owns every floor he's ever stood on. Carolyn heard him from the kitchen. She didn't need to look at the monitor. She knew his walk by now, the way you know a song you didn't mean to memorize. She plated the broth herself. Always the broth first. Clear, amber-colored, with 3 thin rings of scallion floating on the surface and a single strip of zucchini that she cut at an angle because she'd read once, early on, that presentation affects taste perception, that the brain begins evaluating flavor before the food reaches the mouth. She'd filed that away like she filed away everything useful. Then she'd kept doing it for 15 years because it turned out she liked making things beautiful. That, too, was a problem she hadn't anticipated. She carried the tray to the dining room herself, set it down, stepped back to the edge of the room, hands clasped in front of her, and waited. Malchin didn't look at the food immediately. He never did. He sat down, adjusted his cuffs, one small, precise motion, and then looked at the bowl. Then he picked up his spoon. The room was so quiet, Carolyn could hear the clock above the serving door. She watched him take the first sip the way a surgeon watches a monitor. Not anxious, just attentive. He set the spoon down. "The broth," he said, without looking up. His voice was low, Korean accented, and completely flat in tone. The way very powerful people speak when they've spent years having every word they say treated like a decree. "It's different tonight." Carolyn didn't move. "Dried shiitake. I added it at the end instead of the beginning. Keeps the flavor from going bitter." A pause. Then, and this was the thing that had no business meaning as much as it did. The corner of his mouth lifted. Just barely. Just for a second. "Better," he said. And then he went back to eating in silence. Carolyn stood in the shadows by the door and watched him eat for the 5,476th time. And she told herself, the same way she told herself every single night, that it meant nothing. She was getting worse at believing that. It was the rice sack. She'd kept the burner phone there for 15 years because it was the one place nobody in this compound would ever reach into without her permission. Not the guards, not the lieutenants, not even Dae-sung, who was genuinely afraid of her opinion on improper rice storage. She'd checked that phone maybe twice a year. Quick, clinical, then back in the bag. It had never vibrated. In 15 years, it had never made a single sound. So when she felt it going off against her palm at 9:17 p.m., her first reaction wasn't fear. It was something colder than fear, resignation. She closed the pantry door, locked it, sat down on an overturned produce crate in the dark, and looked at the screen. One text, unknown number, 4 words. "It's time. Call in." She called. It rang once. "Well?" The voice on the other end was male, American, sacked with the kind of unearned cheerfulness that certain dangerous people use to remind you that they don't have to be afraid of anything. She hadn't heard it in 3 years. She'd hoped, in the way you hope for things you know won't happen, that she never would again. "The widow, how's the cooking?" "What do you want?" It wasn't a question. Now, see, that's not how we greet old friends. "What do you want?" A beat. Then the cheerfulness dropped like a mask hitting the floor. "Midnight tonight. The contract's been reactivated. Standing order? Full liquidation. You complete the job before the clock hits 12, or we send a cleanup crew for the target and for you." A pause. "Both of you, Carolyn. You understand what I'm saying?" She understood. 15 years, she said. Her voice didn't shake. It never shook. "You left me here for 15 years. We left you there because you were useful there. You've been feeding us intelligence from inside the Seven Stars Syndicate for a decade and a half. But the client's gotten impatient, and frankly, so have we. The operation's over. Clean it up, come home, and we call it even. And if I don't, then the crew arrives at midnight, and you're both a loose end. Another pause, and she could hear him smiling. I'd pick the option where you're still breathing, personally. But hey, that's just me. The line went dead. Carolyn sat in the dark pantry with the phone in her hand for a long time. The smell of the broth was still in the air, drifting through the crack under the door. Miles Davis had ended. The kitchen was quiet. The zookeeper, that's what they called him inside the agency. Say because he managed assets, which was the polite word for people like her. People who'd been put somewhere and told to stay still and perform and not develop feelings about the bars. She'd met exactly one other operative who'd gone this long without extraction. They'd found him in a river in Prague. Here's something they don't teach you in any intelligence training program, because the people who design training programs don't want to say it out loud. There's a concept called identity capture, and it's not specific to espionage. It happens to undercover cops, to long-term caregivers, to anyone who performs a role with sustained emotional investment for long enough. The psychology is straightforward. The human brain cannot maintain a false identity indefinitely without some portion of the self genuinely becoming that identity. It's not weakness, it's neurology. The brain doesn't file real and performed in separate folders. It just processes behavior. And behavior, repeated daily for 15 years, rewires you. Carolyn Mack, nay, something else entirely, had been performing the role of a cook for so long that she had genuinely become one. The problem was, she'd also never stopped being the other thing. And right now, sitting in the dark with a dead phone in her hand and a deadline she didn't ask for, both of those things were at war inside her chest. She was 29 years old when she walked through the service entrance of the Seven Stars compound for the first time. Different name, different documents. A culinary certificate from a school in Lyon that was real. They'd actually made her complete the program, 18 months. Yet because the cover had to be airtight, and a letter of recommendation from a restaurant in Hong Kong that had since conveniently closed. She'd been briefed on An Malchin for 6 weeks. His habits, his preferences, his security rotation, his known allergies. She knew he ate alone. She knew he trusted almost nobody. She knew the kitchen position had been vacant for 4 months because the previous cook had stolen from him and was no longer a problem anyone needed to solve. She knew how she was going to kill him. It was her 3rd day on the job when it almost didn't happen. She'd been in the kitchen late, 11 p.m., learning the layout, memorizing where everything was stored the way she memorized everything. Systematically, silently, when one of the senior guards came in. Big man. The kind of big that comes from a specific combination of genetics and a career where size is an asset. He'd been drinking. She could smell it from across the room. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something in Korean that she understood perfectly and pretended not to. She kept her back to him, kept moving, kept her hands on the counter, and her face neutral, and ran through her options quietly in her head, because that's how you stay alive. You don't react, you calculate. He stepped closer. And then a voice came from the doorway. Quiet. Flat. With that particular quality of stillness that she'd come to know very, very well over the following 15 years. Byung-soo? One word, just a name, said like a fact. The guard went completely still, turned around, and Malchin was standing in the doorway in a black robe, barefoot, holding a glass of water, looking at the guard with eyes that had absolutely no expression in them whatsoever, which, she would learn, was far more frightening than if he'd looked angry. The guard left. Malchin looked at her for a moment, and she looked back at him, chin level, because she'd already decided on her cover's personality, and this was who Carolyn Mack was. And then he said, in accented but precise English, "I apologize for him." She blinked. That she hadn't calculated for. "You don't need to apologize." "No," he said. "I do. In my house, people are treated with respect. That includes the staff." A pause. "That guard will not be a problem after tonight." He left. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, very still, with a feeling she hadn't been trained to deal with and didn't have a name for yet. That was the first time she hesitated. It would not be the last. The vial was small, smaller than you'd think for something designed to end a person. It fit between 2 fingers, barely the length of a lip balm, and the liquid inside was colorless, odorless, would read as cardiac arrest on any autopsy not specifically testing for the compound. The agency had given it to her on day 1, just in case, the zookeeper had said, which both of them knew meant eventually. She'd carried it in her kit for 15 years, moved it from her bag to the pantry, to the bottom of the spice drawer, to a false panel behind the flower shelf, kept it close, never used it, never lost it. She wasn't sure, honestly, whether she'd held onto it because she thought she might still complete the mission or because she needed to know it was there. A reminder of what she was, in case she started forgetting. Now she stood at the prep counter at 10:30 p.m. with the vial in her left hand, and, in her right, a heavy clay pot of galbi jim that had been braising since 4 in the afternoon. Spicy. Deep red from the gochujang, falling off the bone short ribs in a broth she'd built from scratch. And yeah, the smell of it alone was enough to make you feel something. It was his favorite. He'd never said so directly. He didn't say things directly, but she'd watched his face for 15 years, and she knew. The way he ate slower with this dish, the way the exhale came earlier, before he'd even finished the bowl. She knew. She set the vial on the counter, looked at it. Here's something most people don't know about poison. And this isn't a story detail. This is actually real. The ancient practice of tasting a ruler's food before it was served wasn't just about checking for poison slipped in by enemies. In many royal courts throughout history, Korean, Chinese, Ottoman, European, the food taster was also responsible for monitoring whether the food had been prepared with hostile intent. They were trained to notice changes in a chef's behavior, not just in the flavor. Trembling hands, averted eyes. The slight hesitation before placing the dish. The body, Haris it turns out, gives away what the mind tries to hide. Malchin had no food taster. He'd refused one for years. He'd said once to a lieutenant whose name Carolyn had later watched him remove from the payroll, "If someone in my own kitchen wants to kill me, they've already won. I'd rather die eating well." She'd heard that through the serving door. She'd stood very still for a long time after. Now she picked up the vial, held it over the pot. The steam rose around her hand. The smell hit her. Gochujang and sesame, and the sweetness of the braised marrow. And she thought about 5,476 dinners. She thought about the way he said better when she changed something small, and it worked. She thought about the morning 3 years ago when she'd come in at 6 a.m. and found a new spice rack installed along the east wall of the kitchen, shorty without comment, without explanation. But it was exactly where she'd mentioned, once, offhandedly, to no one in particular, that she wished she had more space. He'd heard. She walked to the sink, and she poured the vial down the drain. She stood there a second, water running, watching the last trace of it disappear. Then she dried her hands, picked up the clay pot, and carried it back to the stove. She had about 90 minutes before midnight. She was going to need every one of them. The banquet had been scheduled for a week. Malchin's 50th birthday, though he'd said, flatly, when his head of operations suggested a celebration, that he didn't celebrate birthdays. His head of operations had pointed out, with the careful tone of a man talking someone off a ledge, that the other syndicate bosses expected an event, due that appearances required it, and that declining the gathering would read as weakness at a moment when the 7 stars could not afford to read as anything but immovable. Malchin had stared at him for a moment, then said, "Fine. Tell Carolyn." So at 11:15 p.m., the dining room had 18 guests, rivals, allies, and the carefully managed middle category of people who were technically both. The long table had been extended. The chandelier was fully lit, and Carolyn's kitchen was running at full capacity, Dai sung on garnish, 2 additional kitchen workers borrowed from the catering rotation, and Carolyn at the center of it all, calling orders, plating with the precision of someone who'd spent a decade and a half making chaos look like calm. She saw the first one at 11:22. Waiter, young, Korean, in the same black and white service uniform as the 6 actual waiters she'd briefed that afternoon. He was carrying a tray correctly, balance good, posture right, and if she'd been watching with her cook's eyes, she probably wouldn't have noticed anything. But she wasn't watching with her cook's eyes. She was watching with the other ones. His left ear, small, flesh-toned, almost invisible against the lobe. An earpiece, not the kind event staff wore to coordinate service. She knew those, had seen them 100 times. This was a different profile, slightly bulkier at the canal, military grade, the kind with bone conduction that picks up sound through the jaw so you can receive instructions without moving your lips. She looked at his hands when he set the tray down on the pass. The index finger of his right hand had a specific callus, not from carrying trays, from a trigger. She kept her face completely still, called a plate order to Daesung, reached past the waiter for the garnish spoon like she hadn't seen a single thing. Then she scanned the room through the service window. 3 more. One at the far door, one by the bar cart, one who'd just come in from the east corridor. All with the same posture, the specific, almost imperceptible tension of someone maintaining a relaxed presentation over a body that is coiled and ready. She recognized it because she'd spent 30 years carrying it herself. Her people, the zookeeper's people, the cleanup crew, they were already inside. She looked at the clock above the service window. 11:31 p.m., 29 minutes. She kept her voice completely even. "Ju Daesung!" He looked up. "I need you to take your break now. Tell the other 2 to go with you. Now." He blinked. "But the second course." "I'll handle the second course." A pause, and she let just enough of the other her come into her eyes that he stopped asking questions. "Take your break. Use the back stairs. Don't come back until I call you." He went. She waited until the kitchen door swung shut behind all 3 of them. Then she crossed to the main kitchen entrance, the double doors that opened onto the dining room corridor. And she threw both deadbolts. Then she turned to the prep counter. She picked up the carving knife, set it down, picked up the 8-inch chef's knife, the one she'd been using for 11 years, handle worn smooth to the exact shape of her grip. Set it down, too. She reached under the counter, so into the back of the lower cabinet, behind the sheet trays, where she'd kept a long, thin, magnetic strip attached to the inside panel. 2 blades, flat and dark. Not kitchen knives. Something older than this kitchen. something she'd brought with her 15 years ago and never put away. She pressed them flat to her forearms, fixed them in place with practiced speed. Then she untied her apron, smoothed the front of her chef's coat, and picked up the tray for the main course. Galbi Jeem, his favorite. She was going to make sure he got to eat it. She pushed through the dining room door. She didn't make it to the dining room. She'd gotten as far as the corridor. Tray balanced, posture straight. Every inch of her, the cook, the server, the invisible woman who belonged exactly here, when she heard the kitchen door behind her open. Not Dae-sung. He'd left through the back stairs. She'd watched him go. She kept walking. The footsteps behind her were too deliberate, too quiet, the way someone walks when they're trying not to sound like what they are. She turned the corner into the small holding area between the kitchen corridor and the dining room entrance. A narrow stretch, barely wide enough for 2 people, where serving staff waited before carrying courses in. Tile walls. A single overhead light. No cameras. She knew there were no cameras because she'd spent the first 3 months in this house memorizing every blind spot in the security system, and she'd never stopped keeping track. She set the tray down on the warming shelf, and she waited. He came around the corner fast. Professional, she'd give him that. Moving with the low, worny compact energy of someone who'd done this before, one hand already extended for the throat grab that would have been quick and quiet if it had landed. It didn't land. She stepped inside the grab, used his own momentum, and redirected him hard into the tile wall. He bounced off it and came back, trained, not deterred. And this time, she saw the blade in his hand. Short, matte black handle. The kind of knife that's designed specifically so it doesn't reflect light. Cute, she thought, not kindly. She didn't go for her forearm blades. Not yet. She reached sideways. Instinct. 15 years of kitchen instinct. And her hand closed around the meat tenderizer she'd left on the prep shelf when she cleared the counter. Heavy, flat-faced, cast iron. It took 2 strikes. The first one she wasn't proud of the angle on. The second one she was. He went down and didn't get back up. She stood over him for a second, breathing evenly, and looked at his face. Young, mid-20s maybe. Someone's asset, same as she was once. She didn't let herself think about that longer than a second, because that kind of thinking got you killed, and she had a room full of guests to keep alive. She dragged him to the walk-in freezer, propped him against the back wall behind the sheet trays. He'd be fine. She hadn't hit him hard enough to do permanent damage. And yeah, he'd be cold when he woke up, but that was honestly the least of his problems. She closed the freezer door, picked up the tray, fixed her chef's coat, pushed through to the dining room. 18 people at the table. The conversation was a specific kind of loud that happens when powerful men are performing relaxation. A little too much laughter, glasses lifted a little too often, everyone pretending the person across from them isn't someone they've considered having removed at least once. Carolyn moved through it like water. She set the first plate in front of a syndicate boss from Busan, who didn't look at her. Set the second in front of his associate, who did look. The wrong kind of look, the assessing kind. And she moved past him without changing her expression by a single degree. She was counting the room as she worked. 4 agency operatives that she'd spotted, possibly a 5th by the east door. She clocked him on her second pass, the way he'd positioned himself with a sightline to both the main entrance and the table. Yeah, that's 5. All of them in service uniforms, all of them holding trays or standing at attention like they were supposed to be there. They were waiting for a signal. She knew how the zookeeper ran operations. He'd want everything simultaneous, clean, maximum confusion in minimum time. The signal would come at midnight, which meant she had She checked the clock on the far wall without turning her head. 11 minutes. She reached Malchin's seat last. She always did. She set the galbi jim in front of him. The clay pot, still steaming, the color of it deep red-brown and perfect. And as she placed the serving chopsticks beside the bowl, she did something she'd never done before in 15 years of service. She placed them wrong. Not wrong in a way anyone in that room would notice. One chopstick parallel to the bowl, one angled slightly away. Maybe 20 degrees, pointing toward the east corridor. To anyone else, it looked like she'd set them down hastily. To anyone trained in a specific agency signal language she'd been taught in a basement in Langley in 2009, it meant hostile presence, east exit compromised, stand by for escalation. She stepped back, looked at Malchin. He looked at the chopsticks. Then he looked at the bowl. Then he picked the chopsticks up and straightened them automatically, with a particular fastidiousness of a man who liked things a certain way, and began to eat. She kept her face perfectly still. He hadn't understood. Of course he hadn't. Why would he? She'd never told him there was a code. She'd never told him anything. She was the cook, and he was the man who ate. And for 15 years, that had been the whole arrangement, and she had no one to blame for this but herself, because she'd had 15 years to establish a contingency, and she'd spent them making broth instead. She moved back toward the kitchen door. 8 minutes. She had to figure out something else. Here's what they teach you in the kind of training programs that don't have graduation ceremonies or yearbooks. In a hostile environment with multiple threats, and a principal who doesn't know they're a principal, your job is environmental control. You can't manage every threat simultaneously. You're one person, not a team. So you shrink the arena. You eliminate exit routes. You force the engagement into the geography that favors you. And honestly, this principle isn't just covert ops. Architects who design military installations, security consultants, even chess players, they all work from the same underlying logic. Control the space, and you control the outcome. The best tacticians in history didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they made the fight happen where they wanted it. Carolyn had spent 15 years learning every inch of this room. She knew exactly where she wanted this fight. She moved along the wall to the main breaker panel. It was behind a painted access door near the east corridor. She knew it was there because she'd watched an electrician use it 2 years ago, and she'd memorized the location the same way she memorized everything. Quietly, without making it obvious, storing it for a future she hoped wouldn't come. She looked at the clock, 4 minutes. She looked at the room. Malchin was eating, 18 guests. See 5 operatives at their stations. A chandelier throwing warm gold light over the whole scene like something out of a painting. She thought, for one very brief, very human second, about what it had been like. 15 years of this. The smell of the kitchen. The sound of that exhale. The spice rack he'd installed without a word. The way he'd stepped into a doorway at 11 p.m. 15 years ago, barefoot, holding a glass of water, and said, "I apologize for him." She thought about Dae Sung, who was currently sitting in the back stairwell eating the snack she'd seen him pocket from the prep counter at noon, waiting for her to call him. She thought about the rice vendor and his bad jokes, the scallions in the early morning light, Mr. O going into the back to get the better ones. Then she opened the breaker panel and killed every light in the building. 3 seconds of absolute dark. Then the emergency track lighting clicked on. Low, red-tinted, the kind that lines the baseboards for evacuation purposes, and the dining room became something out of a fever dream. 18 people at a table, half on their feet already, voices rising in Korean and Mandarin, and one very loud man from Busan who was shouting something Carolyn didn't have time to translate. She was already moving. She dropped the serving tray, let it hit the marble, let it clang. Because the sound was useful, it was disorienting. It pulled two heads in the wrong direction, and she snapped both forearm blades free from their mounts in one motion. Felt them settle into her hands the way old things do when they've been carried long enough. Sell like they knew her grip. The first operative had broken cover immediately. That's what the dark does to a plan. It reveals who's actually there for the dinner and who's been waiting for permission to move. He was coming around the end of the table fast, suppressed weapon low, sightline aimed at the head of the table where Mal Chin had been sitting. Carolyn was between them before he finished the turn. She wasn't going to describe what happened next in detail. Some things don't need narrating. What mattered was that she was fast, faster than someone who'd spent 15 years cooking had any right to be, and that the operative went down hard, and she was already moving to the second one by the time the first hit the floor. So here's something true about close-quarters combat that most people don't know, and that military historians have documented extensively. In engagements under 10 feet, weapon training accounts for maybe 30% of outcome. The rest is architecture. Where you are, where they are, what's between you, and whether you understand the geometry of the room better than they do. A trained fighter in unfamiliar terrain loses consistently to a less trained fighter who knows every inch of the space. It's documented. It's measurable. It's why special operations units spend more time on environmental recon than almost anything else. Carolyn knew this room better than anyone alive. The second operative came from the Barkhart side. She used the corner of the table. The third was smarter, hung back, where he tried to create distance. But distance in a room this size is an illusion, and she'd closed it before he'd finished recalculating. The fourth came at her from behind and got a forearm across the throat and the marble floor introduced to the back of his skull in a sequence that happened so fast, the guests closest to them didn't fully process it until it was over. The fifth, the one by the east door, the one she'd clocked on the second pass. He didn't rush. He watched. She'd been tracking him in her peripheral vision the whole time because the one who waits is always the most dangerous one in the room. He was older. The way he stood, slightly turned, 1 foot back, she recognized the training. Not the same program as the others. Senior asset. The zookeeper had sent a closer. He raised the weapon, and Mal Chin hit him from the side with a crystal decanter that had probably cost more than most cars. Not elegantly, not with any particular technique, just hard. The way a man who's been in enough violence to understand the basic physics of it hits someone when he doesn't have time to overthink it. The operative dropped. Mal Chin stood over him, breathing hard, the shattered remains of the decanter still in his hand, his black suit jacket torn at the shoulder. He looked at the room, at the 5 people on the floor, at the 18 guests who were pressed against the walls or under the table, or in the case of the very large man from Busan, somehow already gone. And then he looked at Carolyn. She was standing in the middle of the room, blood on her coat, not hers, both blades in her hands, chest rising and falling with the particular calm of a body that's been through enough of this to know the difference between the kind of shaking that means danger and the kind that means adrenaline. The emergency lighting painted everything red. Mal Chin looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Mind in English, who are you?" The room had gone completely silent. The remaining guests, the ones who hadn't fled, were frozen. Nobody was going to interrupt this. Whatever this was, it radiated the specific energy of something that had been a long time coming, And even men who ran criminal syndicates understood when they were watching someone else's reckoning. Carolyn lowered the blades. Didn't put them away, just lowered them, hands at her sides. "My name is Carolyn Mack," she said. Her voice was even, flat. The same voice she used to tell Mr. O his scallions weren't fresh enough. "I was recruited by a United States intelligence contractor in 2008. My assignment was to infiltrate your household, establish access, gather intelligence on 7-Star syndicate operations, and—" She paused, just for a second. "And eliminate you." The silence in the room got a different texture. Malchin hadn't moved. His expression was the one she knew least. Not the flat authority face, not the almost smile over the broth. Something she didn't have a name for. Something that looked almost like he was doing math. 15 years, he said. 15 years. You had the access. Not a question. Every night, she said. I had the poison in my kit from day one. Tasteless. Undetectable. I could have done it any of 5,000 nights and been on a plane back to the States before anyone knew what killed you. But you didn't. No. Why? And here was the moment. The one she'd been carrying for 15 years without knowing it was there. The way you carry a stone in your shoe that's so familiar, you stop noticing it's hurting you. She looked at him, straight on, the way she always had. Because on day 3, she said, you walked into a kitchen at 11 p.m. in bare feet to apologize to a cook you'd known for 72 hours. And I'd spent 3 years before that watching people like you. I knew what your file said you were. I knew the things you'd done. And none of it, was on your face in that hallway. A beat. You were just a man who thought it mattered that someone had been disrespected in his house. And I didn't know what to do with that. Malchin said nothing. I kept the poison, she continued. I told myself every year I was waiting for better intelligence. Better timing. I told myself a lot of things. She looked down at the blades in her hands, then back up. By year 5, I'd stopped lying to myself about it. By year 10, I'd stopped pretending there was a version of this where I completed the mission. A pause. I'm not asking you to understand that. I'm just answering your question. The room breathed. Malchin looked at the 5 people on the floor, then at the room, then back at her. The people who sent them, he said, who hired them. Agency contractor, they call him the zookeeper, but the original client. She stopped, looked at him carefully. The original contract wasn't a rival syndicate, Malchin. The person who hired the agency to have you killed was someone inside your own house. The math on his face shifted. Who? She'd known this moment was coming since she decoded the client file 3 years into her assignment. A piece of intelligence she'd sat on, turned over, decided how to use, and ultimately kept close to her chest, like everything else she'd accumulated in 15 years of careful, quiet attention. She looked at the far end of the table. Malchin followed her gaze. His brother, Sung-jin, who had been sitting very still at the end of the table since the lights came back on, who had not fled with the others, who had watched the entire thing with an expression of absolute calm that was, now that you were looking at it with fresh eyes, not the calm of someone in shock, but the calm of someone who had been hoping for a specific outcome and was currently recalculating, looked back at his brother. A long moment passed. Sung-jin stood up, straightened his jacket. Hyung? Don't, Malchin said. Just that one word, in the same flat tone he used for everything. But something in it landed differently now, like a door closing. Sung-jin looked at Carolyn. There was something in his eyes that might have been an appeal, and she understood it. in an abstract way. She was the variable. She was the one who'd seen the file. If she weren't here, she met his gaze and held it without blinking. He looked away first. She went back to the kitchen. Not because anyone told her to. Not because the situation was resolved. It wasn't, not yet. But because there were things to do and she'd spent 15 years doing them. And her hands, at this point, knew the kitchen better than they knew anything else. She started cleaning, not the dining room. She'd get there. The kitchen first. The prep counter, the stove, the floor near the walk-in freezer, where she'd dragged the operative in the dark and left a scuff on the tile that was going to take some actual effort to get out. She got the mop from the supply closet. She ran hot water in the deep sink. She heard Malchin come in about 20 minutes later. She didn't turn around, just kept mopping. He came and stood on the other side of the counter. She could feel him there the way you feel a change in air pressure. That particular stillness he carried. "Sungjin," he said. It wasn't a question or an explanation. It was just the word. The way you say a word when you're still turning it over, trying to find the place where it fits in the story you thought you knew. "I found the contract documentation in year 3, she said. Your brother was 19. He thought you were going to take the syndicate in a direction he didn't want. He thought if you were gone, he'd have the influence to reshape it." She paused, wrung the mop out. He was 20 years old when he decided. People do complicated things when they're scared of being irrelevant. "You should have told me." "Yeah." She didn't argue with that. "I should have." A long silence. The kind that, in another context, another life, might have been comfortable. But it wasn't another life. It was this one, which was messy and specific and full of 15 years of things that had been true the whole time and unspoken the whole time, which is maybe the same as lying and maybe isn't, and she genuinely wasn't sure anymore. "You said you were sent to kill me," he said. Yes. "And you stayed to protect me." "I stayed because I couldn't leave." She stopped mopping, set the handle against the wall, and finally turned around and looked at him. "There's a difference. Look, I'm not standing here telling you I'm the hero of this story. I'm not. I came here to end your life, and instead I just stayed. And somewhere in those 15 years, the reason I was staying changed. And then it changed again. And at some point, I stopped keeping track of the reason and just..." She gestured at the kitchen. "Just did this." He looked at the kitchen, then back at her. "The spice rack," he said. She blinked. That she hadn't expected. "You mentioned it once," he said. "To the junior cook. You said you wished you had more wall space on the east side. I heard it through the serving door." A pause. "I told the house manager the next morning." She looked at the spice rack, the one on the east wall. 11 years of her hands reaching for it without once thinking about who put it there. "You heard that," she said. "I hear most things." He looked at her with that expression she'd never been able to fully read. That apex predator recognition, the os, you too of it. "I knew you weren't just a cook." She went very still. "Year 3, he said. "I saw how you moved when that guard cornered you. You didn't panic, you calculated. A cook panics." He paused. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know who sent you. But I knew." Another pause. "I kept you because you were the only person in this house who looked at me like I was a person and not a verdict." And there it was. That was the thing she'd spent 15 years not saying to herself. That Jung goes 2 directions. That you can be someone's secret and still, somehow, be seen by them. That 15 years of feeding someone and being present for someone and choosing, every single night, to protect someone rather than end them. That wasn't performance. Even when it started as performance. That was just what it was. Here's what this story is really about. And stay with me, because this part matters. There's a psychological principle called moral licensing. The idea that past good behavior can unconsciously give people permission to do harm. You did something generous last week, so you're a little less careful this week. You've been disciplined for months, so you earn the right to slip. So researchers have studied it extensively and found it's one of the most consistent patterns in human behavior. But Carolyn Mack's story is the inverse of that. She came to do harm, and the accumulation of small daily choices to do the opposite, to show up, to care, to choose protection over destruction, didn't give her permission to harm. It changed what she was. Not because she woke up one morning and decided to be different, but because the consistent practice of care, repeated for 15 years, rewired her. The actions preceded the identity. She didn't become someone who protected him because she felt a certain way about it. She felt that way because she'd been protecting him for so long. Psychologists call this behavioral identity formation, and the application isn't just for assassins with complicated feelings. It's for anyone who's ever wanted to become a different kind of person, a more patient one, a kinder one, a more disciplined one. You don't wait to feel like that person before you act like them. You act like them first. The feelings follow the behavior. Every time. Carolyn didn't choose to care about Malchin. She chose, night after night, to cook for him with attention and protection and precision. And then one day, she looked up, and the caring was just there, already built, brick by 15 years of showing up. That's the real secret ingredient. The bodies were gone by 3 a.m. Malchin had resources for that kind of thing, and she didn't ask about the specifics, and he didn't offer them. The dining room was cleaned. The crystal was swept up. The table was reset. She didn't know why. Force of habit, maybe. Hers or someone else's. The chandelier threw the same gold light it always did, over an empty room that smelled like nothing had happened. Sungjin had been taken somewhere. She didn't know where. She didn't ask about that either. That was Malchin's gravity to manage, not hers. A brother who tried to have him killed at 20 years old and spent 15 years pretending he hadn't, sitting across that table, eating food she'd cooked. The weight of that was Malchin's to carry, and she had enough of her own. She was in the kitchen at 3:45 a.m. when she heard his footsteps again. She'd know them anywhere. He came in and sat on the stool at the end of the prep counter, the one Dae-sung used when she needed him to peel something, and he sat there and looked at the counter and didn't say anything for a while. Carolyn was washing the clay pot, the Galbi gym pot. She'd already cleaned everything else. "You know," she said, not turning around, "most people would have shot me." "I thought about it," he said. "What stopped you?" A pause. "The chopsticks." She turned around. "I didn't understand the signal," he said, "but I knew it was one. You don't set chopsticks like that by accident. You were trying to tell me something." He looked at her. The person who was there to kill me wasn't trying to warn me. She held the pot in her hands and thought about 15 years of signals she'd never sent, things she'd never said, distances she'd maintained, because maintaining them was the professional thing. And also, if she was being honest, the cowardly thing. Because if she never said it, and he never knew, so that she could keep pretending that what they had in this kitchen was just function, just service, just the performance that had started as a lie, and somewhere along the way stopped being one. "What happens now?" she said. He thought about it, which she respected. He was a man who didn't answer questions he hadn't actually considered. "The agency will send someone else," he said. "Eventually." "Yes." "And you know how they operate." "Better than most." He looked at her. That look. The one that was recognition and something past recognition and something she was going to have to figure out a name for eventually. Then, he said, I suppose you should stay. She set the clay pot down on the drying rack. She untied her apron, folded it, set it on the counter, picked it back up, and put it back on. It's almost 4 a.m., she said. Market opens at 6. No. I was thinking, she said, turning back to the counter, pulling a cutting board down from the rack, that I'd make congee in the morning. Rice, ginger, century egg, simple. I don't like century egg. I know, it's for me. She looked over her shoulder at him. You can have the broth. Something shifted in his face. That almost smile, the one that was only ever there for a second before the flatness came back. Better, he said. And she turned back to the counter, and the kitchen was quiet. And outside the windows, Seoul was beginning to do the slow gray thing it does in the hours before the market opens. And somewhere in Mapogu, Mr. O was probably already setting up his stall, checking the produce in the back, getting the better ones ready for a woman who always knew the difference. Tomorrow at 6 a.m., she'd be there. Same as always. Look, if you've made it to the end of this story, you didn't just watch a woman survive a banquet. You watched someone prove something that took 15 years to demonstrate. The lesson isn't about espionage. It's about identity. It's about the fact that who we become is not determined by where we started or what we were originally sent to do. It's built in the daily choices, the consistent actions, the decision made thousands of times across thousands of ordinary mornings to show up and do the work with care. Carolyn came as a weapon and became a protector, not because she decided to, but because she acted like one long enough that there was no going back. That's real. That's documented. And that hits different when you realize it applies to your own life, too. So here's what I need from you before you go. If this story moved you, if Carolyn's 15 years of silent loyalty meant something, if in Mal Chin's quiet spice rack meant something, if you felt even a fraction of what it means to be seen by the last person you expected, then don't just let this sit. Hit that like button.